all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
It's time for a solid hour of Tea Party Power. And now, here's Al Gore's Midnight Massage Man, Mark Gillar.
Welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. That intro was played in honor of our guest today, Mr. Steve Goreham. Steve is the Executive Director of the Climate Science Coalition of America and author of 4 books on energy, climate change, sustainable development, and public policy, with over 100,000 copies in print. He's here today to talk to us about his new book, Green Breakdown: The Coming Renewable Energy Failure. Steve, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Mark. Great to join you. Happy Labor Day.
Thank you. Thank you. It is, in fact, Labor Day, and I appreciate you working on Labor Day to join us on the show. Now, that intro I played was in your honor. It's an intro I haven't used in probably 8 years, and I think a lot of people probably forgot, but Al Gore, on occasion, when he was traveling, was a naughty boy, and that's what that's a reference to for anybody who's wondering. But more importantly, you join us today in the middle of a heat wave. I'm actually talking to you from Bryan, Texas, which is right near Texas A&M University in Central Texas, and we have had a tremendous heat wave this summer. Every single day, the temperature climbing above 100. So I'm sure there are a lot of people who would say to a climate realist, I'm not going to use the term denier because I think that's rude, but they would say to a climate realist, what do you mean there's no such thing as global warming? Look what's going on in Texas. There's like 106, 109 every day. I mean, how could you possibly say that global warming isn't an issue?
Yeah, you have had a very hot summer in Texas. I think you've gotten fairly close to your record. The record was set, there was a tie, 1936 and 1994 at 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and I think you're pretty close this summer. It's possible that a new record would be set. And I basically have said there is no, I never have said there's no global warming. There's global warming, there's global cooling. Earth's temperatures are changing all the time throughout history. Climate change is not only real, it's continuous. The real question is what is causing the climate change, and whether it's really possible for us to control global temperatures by driving electric vehicles or changing our light bulbs. That's where the dispute comes in. But it is a very hot summer. In the West overall has had a number of hot years over the last 20 or so. But it is still true that we have 70%, 36 of the U.S. state high temperature records were set prior to 1970, and 23 of the 50 state high temperature records were set in the 1930s. So we've had warm times in the past. We have a warm time now, and that's weather.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. If you look at the last 1,000 years, where would this last 100 years rank in terms of centuries when it comes to heat?
Yeah, we've had, as a matter of fact, headlines back in early July where this was the hottest day in 100,000 years, or the hottest month, I think, at 180,000 years. Those data were flat out wrong. There is much evidence from geology over the last 20,000 years since the last ice age that today's climate is not historically warm. We had warmer times 1,000 years ago when the Vikings settled southwest Greenland and colonized it there. It was warmer 2,000 years ago when the Romans conquered the Mediterranean and their soldiers wore those short skirts, and it was warmer 4,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago. We've had literally multi-century periods of time in the last 10,000 years when it has been warmer than the last 100 years here. nevertheless, we have many, many people proclaiming that these are all-time highs, but that's really not what the geologic evidence shows.
Well, Steve, anytime we have a heat wave, anytime there's a record broken from a heat standpoint, the global warming people are going to come out and scream, you see man-made global warming. Actually, they call it climate change now, but it's going to happen every single time. Every time there's a fire, take what's going on in Hawaii. They're going to come out and say that this is due to global warming. So I think a lot of people have come to expect it. I mean, even Bill Clinton has made fun of Al Gore. One day, Bill Clinton was giving a speech on the first day of spring, and he said, I want to welcome you all here on the first day of spring, or as Al Gore likes to call it, proof of global warming. And I thought, oh my goodness, did Bill Clinton just make fun of Al Gore for global warming? And he had, and it's something that Al Gore deserves. I mean, every single time there's a heat wave or a flood or anything, and they have it both ways. I mean, if there's a flood, it's global warming. If there's a drought, it's global warming. At one point, I had a website where I had put up all these different claims about global warming and arranged the juxtaposition so it looked ridiculous. I mean, it was something that caused bigger spiders, smaller spiders, a saltier Atlantic, a less salty Atlantic. It even caused more divorce and supposedly, more business for prostitutes. So when I look at all that, I'm just thinking, was that people in the social sciences trying to get their part of the pie? So, I mean, it just seems to me that a lot of this is money driven, a lot of it is control driven, and this isn't really what your book is about, but how much of this is due to a genuine belief that this planet is about to boil over, and how much of it is about controlling people?
Well, that's always hard to say. I don't profess to know what's in people's hearts. Former Vice President Gore has always been an environmentalist since the 1970s. I think he and many folks believe that we do have a climate crisis. But they've also said that we can exaggerate a little bit, if you will. Mr. Gore has said that because the situation is so dire, we can exaggerate. And of course, the news media loves it because it sells copy, and and we have all these. And now they're naming all the storms, right? And now we never used to have what the temperature felt like. Now they give what the temperature feels like rather than the average temperature. So there's an awful lot of this that is hyped up. I think both candidate Ramaswamy and
Chris
our
Christie,
former president, have called it climatism, and Governor DeSantis has called it politicization of the weather. It is unfortunate, though, and my book is really about what's going on with energy, because that's where it really harms people. We are heading down the track for a green breakdown, and the regular people are going to pay a high price for what's going on with our energy, with our forced energy transition.
When you look at the people that are being hurt by this, a long time ago, a couple of Irish filmmakers, Phelim McAleer and Anne McElhaney, put out a movie called Not Evil, Just Wrong, and they demonstrated how much harm was coming to people around the world. The poor people in the United States would be considered rich in some other countries, but there are places where no one has a job and they won't reopen a gold mine for environmental reasons. And there are just so many places where low-cost electricity, and you do talk about the importance of that in your book, low-cost energy, are not available, and they may never become available because the world doesn't want to build any more coal-powered electrical plants. I mean, people are being hurt by this every single day, and it sort of knocks a hole, I think, in the argument of, well, okay, let's say climate change isn't real, or let's say it's not going to lead to the world boiling over. Isn't it better to be safe than sorry? I mean, no one's really getting hurt by taking these precautions, and that's just not true, is it?
That is not true. I do think, however, that much of the world, is placing a higher priority on having electrical power and have reliable electrical power rather than the alarm that's going on. We have about a seventh of the world right now the United States, Europe, the wealthy nations, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and some others that are really pushing this energy transition. But about 6/7 of the world isn't pushing it. Coal is still the biggest source of electricity around the world. The big thing that's impacting many of these nations is that the banks in the wealthy nations are refusing to lend on traditional hydrocarbon fuel plants, oil, gas, and coal. China is still doing that to a large extent. So that is harming some of the folks out there. But there's, for example, there's $400 billion right now being spent in Africa on natural gas projects, on acquisition of gas, on refining of gas, on pipelines. As a matter of fact, I think what is going on is we have about 6/7 of the world that is continuing to boost their use of hydrocarbon fuels or fossil fuels, if you want to call it that. And we have the rest of us saying, oh, this is really terrible, and we've got to cut back and make this transition.
What would you say, Steve, to people who think that, well, wind and solar are practically free? I mean, the wind is free, the sunlight is free. I mean, isn't that a lot more inexpensive and a lot more efficient than using the fossil fuels?
Yeah, we hear that over and over. Former Vice President Gore said that. Many headlines ring that. It is true that the cost of wind and solar have come down quite a bit, and in some marginal cases, the kilowatt hours per cents or per dollar, they are cheaper in the short term. The problem is that that's only part of the story. And if you look at nations that I love to put up a graph that I do about the nations in Europe from public sources. But if you take a look at the nations in Europe, you see that the nations that use the most wind and solar, for example, Germany and Denmark, which have the most use in Europe, pay the highest electricity costs. If wind and solar were cheaper, you'd expect the nations that use the most wind and solar to have the lowest electricity costs, but it is exactly the opposite. Denmark and Germany today pay 3 times what we pay in the United States for electricity. You see a similar thing in the United States. Most of the states that are putting a lot of wind turbines have faster rising electricity prices than the national average, or the nations that don't put in wind. And the reason is 2 big reasons. One is you have to build transmission lines out to remote areas where you normally have a power plant near a city and you already got a transmission line there. Instead, you have to go way out in the mountains up on some ridge. That's expensive. And then in addition, intermittency is a big, big issue. You don't get solar at night, and when the wind doesn't blow, you have to have a backup system. And so if you put in a lot of wind and solar, you end up running your traditional natural gas coal plants at lower utilization rates, and you're building a lot more capacity, and so you're boosting the cost of electricity. California is a great example. California now has the second highest electricity rates in the nation, Green California. They passed up all of New England in the last 3 years. They're right behind Hawaii, and just very, very expensive to put in these renewables. And so to the extent that we push this transition to wind and solar, the prices are going to get very, very expensive for everyday citizens.
Speaking of Europe, with all the windmills that they have put up there, have they been able to close any of the traditional power plants?
Well, they've closed some of them for a little while, but then they had what I'll call the first green transnational energy crisis. Over the last 2 years, they've had a big problem. Matter of fact, in the summer of 2021, the wind didn't blow much in Europe. Electricity output from wind was down about 20 to 30%. And so they burned natural gas all year. And by the end of 2021, this was 2 or 3 months prior to the Ukraine invasion, their electricity prices skyrocketed. The price of natural gas went up by a factor of 5, and the price of electricity went up by a factor of 6 before the invasion of Ukraine. And then after the invasion of Ukraine, when gas was cut off from Russia, things went much, much higher. And so they are still today. It's come down some, but we still have gas prices double what they were 2 years ago, and electricity prices 4 times as high. And so what they've done is restarted a whole bunch of plants. Germany restarted 27 coal-fired power plants. They've announced plans to increase gas production in Netherlands and Norway and Italy and other nations. And they've also ordered 25 new liquefied natural gas terminals, import terminals, so they can get gas from the rest of the world. Matter of fact, the country that kept the lights on in Europe last winter was the United States. United States and Qatar shipping natural gas to Europe so they could keep the lights on. So this idea that you can put up wind and solar and meet your electricity needs is really run into a big roadblock in Europe.
That leads us right into my next question. You know, in your book, you say that we are headed for a green breakdown. What exactly did you mean by that?
So that primarily addresses this goal to get to net zero. The United States, many states in the Union, many cities, and again, the wealthy nations are pushing to have zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And the way that they say they're going to do that is to convert all the processes, utilities, and transportation to not emit carbon dioxide, which occurs whenever you burn something, by and large, and then or capture whatever they can't eliminate. And this just isn't going to happen. Nobody's going to get anywhere close to net zero by 2050. We're going to have higher electricity prices, higher energy prices. We're going to have electricity blackouts. We've already seen that in Oklahoma, Texas, California. The February 2021 blackout in Texas, power was off for 72 hours to more than 4.5 million people, and they had about 700 people die. You know, a very, very big problem. So the more we try and switch to wind and solar, the more blackouts we're going to have. The third thing that green energy means is less freedom. They're going to be taking away people's gas stoves, and they're going to try and force everybody to move to electric vehicles and get rid of gasoline cars. And then the fourth thing are these transnational energy shocks like Europe has seen. We're going to see more of those. The harder they try and push this transition. So the green energy transition is going to break down. We're not going to get to net zero by 2050. We're still going to have a majority of our electricity and our transportation that is driven by oil, gas, and in some cases coal.
One of the things you point out in the book is that there are countries where daily power outages are just expected. It's nothing to go 6 hours, even 11 hours without power. I was talking to a guy, a local business owner from Pakistan, and he was saying there only the wealthiest of the wealthy have air conditioning in their homes, and that's usually just in their bedrooms. Whenever I hear all these young people, you know, screaming about getting the CO down to 350 parts per million, I don't think many of them realize the sacrifice that that's going to take. A chapter in the book that I really loved was the one where you sort of painted a picture of what the world was like for the average individual before we had low-cost electricity, before we had the Industrial Revolution. Paint that picture for my listeners. Talk to them about everything that electricity, low-cost electricity, has done for us, and how far back in time would we have to go to hit these goals that the climate alarmists want us to hit?
Well, you're right. Around the world today, we have about 1 billion people without access to electricity, but then there's another 2 billion that have regular blackouts. You mentioned Pakistan, India, much of Africa has that problem. And it's really a big problem when your electricity's going out. I mean, these people sit at a restaurant in Africa, and then they turn the candles on when electricity goes out. They're sitting in the dark and trying to eat their food. Big problems. Matter of fact, Central Africa, about 40% of the people there, even the people that have electricity, don't even have a fan, let alone air conditioning. And the temperatures are typically in the summer about 90 degrees Fahrenheit. They're very expensive. These are big issues, and the way to solve these is not trying to put up solar, which is very weak in terms of the output, or wind. They're also very seasonal. It's to put up traditional power plants. In India, there's still about 250 million people that don't have electricity access, and they're trying to get those. But electricity runs everything we do, not only our lights, but the simple thing is a refrigerator. In the U.S., the average U.S. home that has the refrigerator in the average U.S. home uses more electricity in a year than many, many people in many nations in the developing world. These things run hospitals. You can't have a hospital really without electricity. Can't have operations and surgery and all those sorts of things. So there are many, many things we take for granted, and we have a lot of people pushing to get rid of our traditional sources that have been very reliable. But we're going to pay for that. By the way, a guy by the name of Mark Christie, a FERC commissioner, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, testified 2 months ago, and I'm going to quote him, "I think we're headed for very dire consequences, potentially catastrophic consequences in the United States in terms of the reliability of our grid. And the more wind and solar all these states push on the people and put those in, we are going to have blackouts. And that's why I say we're going to have a breakdown. People are going to say enough of this. They're going to demand a return to low-cost and reliable energy. And we're going to get back to something that's sensible in terms of energy policy."
Steve, in the United States, belief or non-belief in climate alarmism seems to be divided along political lines, along the political divide. Democrats tend to believe everything about it. Republicans tend to say, yes, the climate's changing, but the idea that the earth is going to boil over is hogwash. I don't know that it's divided along politically ideological lines in other countries. Why do you think it's that way in the United States?
It is remarkable in the United States. I'm not sure exactly how that arose. I think there's the things driving. First off, I think the world jumped to a conclusion. Back in 1988, they held hearings in the Senate, and Dr. James Hansen of NASA came and testified, and he said he was 99% sure the Earth was warming and humans were causing it. 1 year later, the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which concluded within another year that humans were causing dangerous climate change. And then we had the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992, when more than 40 nations in the European Union signed up to emissions cuts. And they've been arguing for the last 30 years or so how much and how often to cut these emissions. But we have tremendous momentum behind this. It's become the center for every environmental group, man-made warming. We have wind, solar, and biofuel industries. We have vice presidents of sustainability and vice presidents, and we have deans of sustainability universities. We have computer modeling teams, about 30 of these around the year that require $20 million every year to run on a supercomputer, these climate models. So there's tremendous momentum behind this. The thing is that regardless, the world's spending almost $1 trillion a year, but it's very unlikely we're going to have a measurable effect on global temperatures from all that spending. This is actually, I call this the biggest superstition in modern history, that we can drive electric cars and stop the oceans from rising. I mean, if you believe that, you better find some better advice.
Well, when you look at the belief system with regard to climate change, younger people seem to be 100% on board. Can't say I'm surprised, when you take a look at some of the stuff that's been out there to brainwash them from an early age. It's just natural that they would believe in it. I mean, I still remember the Build-A-Bear people saying, Santa's not going to be able to come this year because there isn't enough snow for the sled to take off. I remember and I said this when I had a guest on a couple of weeks ago. In Great Britain, the child psychologists were seeing an uptick in the amount of patients because the kids were terrified of global warming. There are all kind of commercials out there, all kind of people scaring you. And certainly the school systems seem to be 100% on board. So if you take these kids starting at age 5 and you preach this stuff all the way through graduate school, then it's not surprising that they believe it. Another thing I've said before on the show, I will have people just tell me, I believe in climate change, I believe in it, and we're going to be in big trouble if we don't do something. and I'll hand them a white sheet of paper, blank sheet of paper, and say, write down all the reasons why you believe that climate change is going to lead to catastrophe. And, other than saying, well, that's what all the scientists say, they really can't come up with anything. Now, I'll tell them that's not really an answer. Tell me specifically what you've seen that makes you believe that, we're all going to hell in a burning handbasket because of climate change. And they'll just say, you have to be crazy not to believe in it. Everybody believes in it.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once, and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
And
it is remarkable.
Yeah.
I had a couple lady students from UCLA call me one time for a phone interview, so I started asking them questions. After a while, I said, "How much you think the Earth has warmed in the last 100 and so years?" One said 5 degrees, another said 10 degrees. But the answer is 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very, very small, and that's in the last 140 years, very, very small. I also conducted an online kind of presentation exchange with the university in Chicago area, and afterwards they had the students make comments. And one student literally said, "This is like finding out there is no Santa Claus." I had never heard that it was possible that nature could be dominating climate and not humans. So, you're right. The universities and the schools are teaching from a very early age only one side of the story. But the evidence actually shows that climate is dominated by natural factors, not man-made emissions. And people are going to find that out over the long run, and that is going to add to this green breakdown. If the basis for this renewable transition is fear of man-made warming, and suppose we get a couple decades of cooling, then it's going to be a little hard to justify the cost and expense of trying to make such a transition.
One of the things you said earlier is that sometimes the other side tends to exaggerate. I know that Al Gore once famously said, "I believe that it's okay to have an over-representation of the facts in order to bring attention to this all-important issue." And I know I've seen Christopher Monckton speak twice in person, and he talks about a scientist telling him, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period, because when you look at the medieval warm period, you say, hey, this isn't a problem. It's happened before. You notice whenever the climate alarmists show a graph, they always start the graph at the end of the little ice age. When naturally you're coming out of an ice age, you're going to expect temperatures to rise. Then there was the famous polar bear mascot that they had for so long. They showed a polar bear that they said was drowning due to a lack of ice, and he was about 50 yards offshore and in no danger at all. And it's just kind of odd to me that one side will actually tell you that they're exaggerating, and yet people still believe it. And the other thing that's surprising, Steve, and maybe you can shed some light on this, and you referenced it in your book, they have failed so often in their predictions. And when that happens, they just delete the prediction from their website or from their Twitter feed, as Greta Thunberg did, and they pretend it never happened, and they go right back to making doom and gloom predictions. I often have to ask, how many times are these guys going to get it wrong before they finally admit that there's not a big problem? Are you surprised by how often they've been wrong and yet nobody calls them out on it?
It is pretty amazing. We have Paul Ehrlich that predicted with the population bomb, we'd have hundreds of millions of people starve to death in the 1980s. That never happened. He said if he was a betting man, he wouldn't think England was going to exist by the year 2000. He said a 50-50 chance. Mr. Gore predicted all the Arctic ice would be gone by 2014. He predicted that in 2008. Yeah, we have many of these predictions. The climate models themselves have over projected the warming by more than double. They were predicting 0.3 of a degree Celsius warming. This is in the first IPCC report. 0.3 of a degree Celsius warming per decade. We're 3 decades out now, and we're less than half of their lowest case estimate. So yeah, it goes on and on. And you also mentioned something else about get rid of the medieval warm period. That was actually in an email as part of the ClimateGate scandal.
Right.
The climate research unit group at the University of East Anglia in England, somebody released a couple thousand emails from that organization, and we had all this information about how we have to keep information out of the scientific journals, how we have to get rid of the medieval warm period, how we have to try and adjust the curves and adjust the data. And so, but I think these people, I still think they're sincere. They think, again, that the potential catastrophe is so great that it justifies falsifying data and fudging things so that people will believe. And that's really a shame. But I think the world is going to find out over the next 3 decades that we can't really control global temperatures, and that we'll probably have some cooling, and that the theory is going to break down as well as the energy transition.
When you look at some of those ClimateGate emails, one of them that stands out is a reference to Mike's nature trick, which was a reference to Michael Mann's hockey stick, which was the result of a study where 2 different data sets were used. One was tree ring, and the other one was these climate collection surface station units. I personally have a huge problem with someone changing data sets at the end of a study because the original data set isn't giving them the results that they want. Now, to be clear, Michael Mann was very upfront about this. He said in the paper that he did it, but I just, it's sort of like, and I told another climate-related guest this a few weeks ago, it's as if you were doing a study on a drug, and my background is in pharmaceuticals, and the study wasn't really working out the way you wanted it to, so you brought in a whole different group of patients for the last part of the graph. I mean, Michael Mann's hockey stick wouldn't point in the direction that it did if they hadn't brought in that second data set. Am I wrong about that?
Well, you're right. The hockey stick showed a flat global temperatures over about 2,000 years, and then in the last century or so, it showed a turn and upward big projection like a hockey stick. But he used for the data for 2,000 years, he used tree rings and a bunch of other things to project this data, and there's a lot of flaws within that. But then what they did is they literally pasted on. Because the tree rings did not show a big uptick in temperature in the 20th century like they wanted to project, they pasted on the temperature record. They used Mike's nature trick to do that. And I mean, it's just, when you think about that, it's just goofy. If he had an accurate measurement of temperature using his tree ring basket of algorithms and things, and they would have showed this big uptick. The data itself would have showed it, but it didn't. It was flat or went down, so they had to paste on the modern temperature record at the end. I've got a little cartoon in my second book, The Mad World of Climatism, and I got a polar bear standing there saying, so this is what they mean by unequivocal.
That's funny. I'm with you on that. I think it's, well, I'm gonna watch my words carefully. I don't want to end up like Mark Stein, but the fact is, I don't think that most people who saw that hockey stick graph had any idea that the part of the graph that pointed up was from a different data set. You could say, well, it was in the scientific paper, but the average person wasn't seeing that. For lack of a better term, the hockey stick for a while sort of became the poster boy for the movement. Yep. It was everywhere. And I know that the average person looking at that did not understand that there was Mike's nature trick, to borrow a term from the ClimateGate emails. So I have a real problem with that. I have a problem with what went on with the polar bears. I have a problem with Al Gore saying it's okay to have an overrepresentation. I have a problem with the guy saying we've got to get rid of the medieval warming period. I mean, hell, I even have a problem with Sheryl Crow saying she only uses one sheet of toilet paper, if you remember that quote. I mean, it just seems like every time you turn around, people are getting caught in little fibs. And I'm not saying Michael Mann lied, because he laid it all out there in his paper, but they're being caught doing things that just don't seem right. And maybe what you're saying is true. Maybe they do think, well, the ends justify the means, but the average individual doesn't know this. And just like you, when I've talked to people about this, well, you know, they use 2 data sets to get that hockey stick, right? And people are like, what? Mm-hmm. And they're very surprised to hear that. Now, one of the things that I think is being portrayed as a savior of the planet is electric vehicles. Talk to me about electric vehicles. Rush Limbaugh used to say, hey, that electricity that powers the electric vehicle came from someplace, so all you're doing is moving the smokestack from the back of or moving the tailpipe, to the electric plant. You're not really reducing CO2. Even if CO2 was going to cause the world to boil over, electric vehicles weren't the answer, is what he used to say. But you tell me, you've got an extensive amount of information about electric vehicles in your book. What, if anything, are electric vehicles going to do for us in terms of preventing climate change?
Yeah, so electric vehicles are interesting. Back about 1900 to 1905, they actually had the largest share of automobiles in the United States. And then Henry Ford came along, and the oil and gas companies came up with very low-cost gasoline, and they just knocked them out. They knocked out electric vehicles. They could go much farther on the roads that were being developed. And so for about a century, electric vehicles were kind of a non-starter. And then we had a recent push to try and reduce various emissions, California, for example, and then eventually carbon dioxide emissions. So we had tremendous breakthroughs in lithium-ion batteries. And so we now have growing world electric vehicle market penetration. Last year it was about 14% of the world of light vehicle new car sales were electric models, only about 6% in the U.S. We have higher penetration, about 20% in Europe and in China, or 30% in China. So EVs are here to stay, but they have a number of disadvantages.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once, and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
Mostly driving range and weight. They're going to be about, because you have to put a big battery in to get any kind of range, they're going to be about 50% heavier. One of the things that's interesting is looking at the weight of these new pickup trucks. And a Ford F-150 pickup, a gasoline vehicle, weighed about 4,700 pounds. But you look at these new EVs, the Ford F-150 EV is 6,500 pounds. The new Tesla truck is going to be about 8,000 pounds. And the Chevy Silverado EV, 8,500 pounds, almost 4 tons. These things are very, very heavy, and they're going to end up paying a lot of road taxes. But we've had kind of a early period of adopters for EVs. And I think a lot of the people that have bought them, and a lot of them are second cars, are they think they're okay. The problem is if you got cold weather, you got to drive long distances, they really don't work out very well. So I think they're going to have a tougher time penetrating world markets at this point. The bad news, though, is we have an EPA who is basically trying to make it impossible for any auto manufacturer to manufacture a line of traditional gasoline or diesel cars. They were imposing carbon dioxide limits and mileage limits. And if we go about 10 years now, you're all going to be forced to buy EVs, which I don't want to do for a number of reasons. So we really need a change in the political system here to try and get back to allowing people to purchase the type of technology or car they want and not forcing everybody to buy an EV because you think it's going to stop the planet from warming. That's where we're really off base.
When you look at the EVs, the range problem is probably the biggest. I mean, for instance, I'm aware of companies that have large fleets of outside salespeople, and in order to appease the green gods, are saying, "Well, hey, we're going to have every single one of our outside sales reps, and when we're talking thousands and thousands of people here, in an EV by." 2023 or 2027 or whatever the date happens to be. And, especially for reps that have large rural territories, they're going to spend half their day recharging their car. If you're used to driving 400 miles a day, you're not going to make it back home. And the company's either going to have to incur a bill at a hotel, or they're going to have to deal with the fact that their rep is spending half of the time they should be calling on clients, recharging their cars. And it's amazing that companies are willing to do that in order to appease what seems to be the issue of the day. I mean, back in the 70s, it was global cooling. Now it's global warming. And they just don't seem to be applying a whole lot of common sense to this. But
a lot of that is for public relations, as you say. That's a big reason for doing that. The EVs, they say they get 200 or 300 miles, but that's basically before you put the air conditioner on. Or if you're in cold weather. In cold weather, you have a real problem with them. You lose about 20 or 30% of your range at 30 degrees. And EVs literally will not charge if it gets cold enough. I was speaking at a conference, met a guy, his wife had a Tesla. They lived in Cleveland, got down to 10 degrees, and the car wouldn't charge at 10 degrees Fahrenheit if it was outside. It literally would not charge. And so unless you run your heated garage all winter, you're going to have trouble charging your vehicle in the winter. People just really, I think most people do not want to put up with this. And so we're going to see EVs penetrate, and my prediction is they're going to be about 20% of our cars are installed. They're about 2% of global cars right now. I think they'll be about 20% by year 2050. But the idea that we're all going to go electric, I think it's just not going to happen. It's again, part of the people that are going to push back against this green transition.
Speaking of pushing back, a lot of times people listen to the show and they say, okay, Mark, I listened to your guest. I became upset. I became angry. I learned things I didn't know. I feel like I'm being played. What now? If you're listening to the show right now and you're sort of like, I don't want to drive an electric vehicle. I don't want to have to give up my gas stove. Other than vote, is there anything else you can do, Steve?
No, I think voting is really the best thing. But again, we are going to see more and more pressures on state governments. Right now, the utilities have capitulated. State governments are putting in wind and solar. But you start having blackouts, and they're going to turn around. We had 2 months ago in California, they had a real shortage of electricity. They didn't end up with brownouts, but they told their people, don't charge your electric car. that was right after they said in California we're going to get rid of all gasoline cars by 2035. So these things just aren't going to add up. And short of getting yourself a backup power supply for your house, I think that's great. But we're going to have to eventually change it at the ballot box, and there is going to be tremendous pressure to do this. Again, the price of electricity going through the roof in many of these states, people are just going to say, hey, we don't need this. So we're going to see it come. It's just going to be a very painful process.
I'm always disappointed when I see people who represent themselves as being conservatives going along with this, even they know about all of the failures of the science in the past to predict what's going to happen in the future with regard to climate change. You mentioned Chris Christie in the book. He said climate change is occurring in humans play a contributing role, you actually called it a very meaningless statement. Why do you feel that way?
Yes. Yeah, well, like I say when I present to people, climate is always occurring, so saying it's occurring is meaningless. And saying that humans contribute to it, like I like to say my 12-pound dog contributes to it. The real question is, what is the size of the human contribution relative to nature? Because the climate is shaped by things that are occurring in the solar system, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land, powerful forces that shape the climate. Sunlight drives all weather on Earth. It falls, much of it is absorbed on the equator, and very little is absorbed in the polar regions. And so we have all of our weather, jet streams and storm fronts and hurricanes and ocean currents that are driven to redistribute energy from the tropics to the poles. We have all these big things going on. Oceans are another thing. Oceans have been rising for the last 20,000 years. You can find a graph on the NASA site that shows that oceans they've risen about 120 meters or 390 feet over the last 20,000 years. No climate scientist can tell you when natural sea level rise stopped and man-made sea level rise began, but our best tide gauges show us that oceans are rising about 7 or 8 inches per century on average, not the 20 feet that Mr. Gore and others have predicted. So these things, we have very powerful forces shaping the climate. Those are the things that are going to drive it. The best thing we can do is adapt. That is the only sensible response to climate change. Like Netherlands has done for hundreds of years, they build seawalls, they build islands out there to stop the ocean rise or prevent the effects of the ocean rise, rather. That's the sensible thing to do, not think that you can build wind turbines and we're going to stop the ocean rise.
I didn't mean to just pick on Chris Christie because he is in no way alone. Here's another quote. He's just one. I'll share this one with you. It's from Matt Gaetz out of Florida. Climate change is real. It's not something people get to choose to believe in or not. Then we all remember Nancy and Newt sitting on the couch saying, together we can solve it. I even heard Glenn Beck say once, if you don't believe in climate change by now, there's something wrong with you. Now, to Newt's credit, he said doing that commercial was the single most dumb thing he had ever done in his political career. So I think Newt realizes his mistake, but people are afraid to say that the emperor is naked. There's just so much pressure.
There's a lot of pressure on people. We have, again, ideology is powerful, and people believe in climatism, and companies as well. These companies have to try and be green, and they have their suppliers pressuring them. They have their customers pressuring them. And so it's very, very tough for people to take a position that says, well, I'm just going to offer you best product, best value, best environmental, lowest pollution levels, that sort of thing, without having to go green and eliminate carbon dioxide, which should not be called a pollutant in any case. So, there's a lot going on. Thing is, the economics, Earth's climate itself, it's going to do what it's going to do, and we're not going to control it by putting in a lot of solar. So people are going to learn, but it's going to take a couple more decades.
Last question, a very important question. Where can people buy your book?
Yeah, so, if they've got a stove, if they've got a car, if they're using electricity, then they need to learn what it says in Green Breakdown. It's available at Amazon. There are ebooks at Amazon, Apple. They can also get a signed copy if they go to my website, Steve Goreham, GOREHAM.com. And they got to learn what the future is going to be for this energy transition.
Education is always the first step, and I have found by staying current over the years that I can pretty much win any climate debate with a leftist who's trying to tell me that I'm evil because I don't believe in climate change, or at least I don't believe in anthropogenic global warming leading to a global disaster. And I think it's funny. I'm going to share this story with you. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a doctor, and he said, "Well, the problem with you Republicans is you don't like facts." And I said, "Well, lay one on me, Daddy-O. What's a fact you don't think I'll like?" And he said, "Well, climate change is." He said, "Climate change is real, and you guys won't acknowledge that." And I said, "Okay, I'll give you 30 minutes to convince me." And, he couldn't think of anything to say. So then he asked me, "Well, why don't you think it's going to be a big problem?" And I went over a lot of the things we talked about today. And his answer was really funny. He said, "Well, you're obviously much more informed on this issue than I am. But I think if I were as informed as you are, I would be winning this argument."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I thought, I told him, his name was Frank. I said, "Frank, if you were as informed as I am, you wouldn't be pushing this nonsense." So, but it's hilarious. And education is the beginning. I mean, you have people on both sides who just believe because that's what they believe. And getting a book like Green Breakdown, reading it, and then being able to very intelligently articulate why we're not going to see the world boil over, may just sway a few more people to join our camp. And considering what we said about the political divide and the climate lines being drawn along the ideological lines of politics, it always helps to convince somebody with facts that, this is not going to be a problem. And I think this book obviously goes a long way toward doing that. So I'm going to say, once again, the title of the book is Green Breakdown, The Coming Renewable Energy Failure. It's available on Amazon. You can get an autographed copy at Steve's website, stevegoreham.com. That's STEVEGOREHAM.com. And we hope you'll run out and get a copy and educate yourself and then start educating your friends. And Steve, with that, we're done. I thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure, and keep up your great work.
Hey, somebody's got to get out there and push it. You're not going to see it on the 5 o'clock news. Thank you very much.
We all know a guy who only occasionally shaves for big occasions, and it's because that occasional shave really hurts. It's the time of year for big occasions, and yet there he is, suffering with that cheap drugstore razor. Let's help him out. Henson Shaving's line of razors, built with aerospace precision, deliver a smooth shave your dad, brother, and even son can enjoy, eventually. With replacement blades just 10 cents each, you'll buy it once and they'll use it for life. How's that for the perfect gift? Celebrate with 100 free blades on your first purchase, and no subscription headaches. HensonShaving.com/holiday.
At Grainger, we're for the ones who specialize in saving the day, and for the ones who've mastered the art of keeping business moving. We offer industrial-grade supplies for every industry, with same-day pickup and next-day delivery on most orders, all backed by real people ready to help. So you can get the right answers and products right when you need them. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.